So let me talk about the other way to solve this problem. So one way to solve this problem is just think straight about inputs. Okay? The other is to think about a two-step problem, very similar to how we approach the consumer's problem, is step one, let's minimize cost for a given output. And step two is to pick the output to maximize profits. Okay, everybody understand that? So that's going to be our process. First, we're going to minimize cost for a given output, and then we're going to choose the level of output to maximize profits. Okay? How do we do that? Well, the first problem I think we already know how to do. First step is minimize the sum of the xi wi subject to f of x1 up to xn equals y. We've seen that problem before, right? For this part of the problem, there's absolutely no distinction between consumer theory and production theory, right? Because we're fixing the output. And whether you're fixing utility or fixing the level of output of the firm doesn't really matter. In either case, we're minimizing costs subject to produce a certain level of something, utility, output, whatever. This yields our cost function, C of W1 up to Wn and y. And that cost function has all the properties of the cost function we already discussed, right? Everything we discussed in the consumer theory about the cost function carries over 100%. And anything we talk about this cost function kind of carries back to the consumer problem. It's the same problem. It's not close, it is exactly the same problem. Except for where we had a utility function before, we now have a production function here. Empirically, there will still be a distinction because empirically, we could actually measure whether we're holding output constant or not. In the other case, we kind of have to infer it, right? We have to infer utility constant. Here, we could tell whether we're holding output constant or not. Okay, but in terms of the underlying theory, so for example, partial C, partial Wi is going to be xi of W1 up to Wn and y. These are called conditional factor demands that correspond to which demand curves in the consumer theory? The Hicksian demand curves from consumer theory. These are called conditional factor demands because they're conditional on output. Okay? And these actually, when people actually think about production problems, are probably more commonly used than what we call the unconditional demands here. These are unconditional because we haven't conditioned on the level of output. In fact, most of the empirical approaches to factor demand actually work with this problem here. Okay? So step one, we're going to minimize cost and get our cost function. So what do we do in step two? How are we going to solve step two now? Well, step two is pretty straightforward now. Only variable we're now choosing in step two is y. We're going to max py minus c of w1 up to wn and y. Okay, that's going to be our problem. Maximizing profits now comes down to choosing the level of output that maximizes our profit, which is the difference between our revenue and our costs. Okay? So some problems, people just start right here. They assume a cost function and blast off. Now, once I assume a cost function, there's some corresponding production function out there that I've implicitly assumed, but you might start by specifying the cost function. So what would be the solution to this problem? Well, it's got one first order condition, p minus c sub y of W1 up to Wn. Y equals 0, which of course is price equals marginal cost. Okay, so that's where our price equals marginal cost condition came back. Okay. Any questions that people have? All right.